Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the National Skillshare series on addressing and preventing gender-based violence at post-secondary institutions in Canada. My name is Kelly Previtt, and I'm the programming coordinator of Courage to Act. We're thrilled to welcome you to the launch of the first Skillshare session today. Before we begin, just a quick note on language and accessibility. Attendees can turn on and off captioning and in Zoom as needed by clicking closed captioning in the controls bar at the bottom of your screen. And you can also listen to this session in French by selecting the French language channel using the interpretation menu. So Courage to Act is a 2-year national initiative to address and prevent gender-based violence on post-secondary campuses in Canada. It builds on the key recommendations within Possibility Seed's vital report, Courage to Act, developing a national framework to address and prevent gender-based violence at post-secondary institutions. Our project is the first national collaborative of its kind to bring together scholars, experts, and advocates from across Canada to end gender-based violence on campus. And so just a little bit about the National Skillshare. A key feature of our project is the National Skillshare series, where our working groups, communities of practice, and keynote speakers will discuss tools, trends, and strategies that will shape how we address and prevent gender-based violence on campus. Attendees will join a connected network of experts and advocates across Canada who are exploring urgent issues and promising practices. Supported by Caucus, these Skillshare sessions are also a recognized learning opportunity. Attendance at 10 or more live webinars and our National Skillshare series will count towards an online certificate. Throughout the National Skillshare series, we'll be sharing with you the tools and resources created by over 150 Courage to Act experts, advocates, and thought leaders from across the country, working together to bring together a harmonized framework to address and prevent gender-based violence at post-secondary institutions in Canada. And I'd just like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging that this work is taking place on and across the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. We recognize that gender-based violence is just one form of violence caused by colonization to marginalize and dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands and waters. Our project strives to honor this truth as we move towards decolonizing this work and actualizing justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across the country. Our project is made possible through generous support and funding from the Department of Women and Gender Equality, or WAGE, Federal Government of Canada. And here to say a few words on behalf of Minister Monsef and WAGE is Parliamentary Secretary Gudie Hutchings. Gudie became a member of Parliament for the riding of Long Range Mountains in October 2015. With her strong community ties, varied business experience, and commitment to Newfoundland and Labrador, she was appointed by Prime Minister Trudeau as the Parliamentary Secretary for Small Business and Tourism in 2015, and later served on the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. In 2019, she was appointed Parliamentary Secretary of Women and Gender Equality and Rural Economic Development. Thank you, Gudie, for joining us.
Kelly, thanks so much for that warm welcome. And Happy New Year all. It's great to be here with you today. And it's great to be here on behalf of the Honourable Maryam Monsef, the Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Wage, or Rural Economic Development, or Wage and Red as we refer to it, right? But before we begin, I want to reflect back on what you said, Kelly. And I'm proud to be here standing on the traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq people. And each one of us here online today, we're gathering from some traditional territory across our wonderful First Nations, whether it's Inuit and or Métis people. So be sure to remember that in everything you do. So I also want to say thank you to you and your group, to Possibility Seeds and the Courage to Act team for inviting me to speak to you and listen to your perspectives that's going to be shared today. We're here to talk about such an important topic, and sadly it continues to be impacted far too many places across our country, which is gender-based violence at post-secondary institutes. We're living in a much different world than we were when the Government of Canada first funded the Courage to Act project back in 2019. We all know this terrible pandemic, the COVID-19, has impacted everyone's day-to-day life, including how we work and study, the people we see, and how we connect with our loved ones. And the holiday season we've just finished has certainly been different for many, many of us, me included. But it's threatened to turn back the clock on all the great work that's been done on gender equality, on economic security, and all the efforts to end gender-based violence. The pandemic has shown so many vulnerabilities and exposed the gaps in our system that touch the lives of women and girls and survivors and their families. And in particular, sadly, again, we've seen the rates increase and more severe of gender-based violence. But throughout all this, I want you to know that our response to the pandemic, to the crisis, was informed by definitely a feminist and an intersectional analysis. That was put on everything because we wanted to ensure that the supports were going to people that needed it most, especially those affected by gender-based violence. We took quick action and we supported organizations and we provided funding to those with helping it with frontline services, to those experiencing gender-based violence. We gave over $100 million to 1,000 organizations to ensure that they keep their doors open and continue the great life-saving work that they do. And we know that the students and the youth are among those most affected and terribly impacted at this time, been affected academically, financially, and psychologically. Many of you are doing courses from home. Your pocketbooks have certainly been impacted, and this is hard on everyone's head, especially students. And all across the country, we continue to see far too many students impacted by GBV, harassment, and sexual assault. It remains far too prevalent, and it impacts all women and LGBTQ students disproportionately, as we've said. According to 2018 data, 1 in 10 women students in our provinces and territories were sexually assaulted in a post-secondary setting. That's approximately 110,000 female students who were assaulted. And among the students, 45% of women and 32% of men personally experienced unwanted behaviors in post-secondary setting, on or off campus. About 1 in 3 lesbian, gay, or bisexual students and 4 in 10 transgender students experience such terrible discrimination. Frankly, these numbers are just disgusting. Even in times of self-isolation, unwanted sexual behaviors and discrimination can take place online and on electronic platforms, including platforms that are meant for learning. These are staggering statistics, and it reminds us of the urgency of our work, of your work, and the importance of earning the trust of young people and students. Sadly, we also know that most students who experience unwanted sexual behaviors do not tend to report them within their institution. Again, according to Stats Canada, only 8% of female students and 6% of male students who were assaulted spoke about the incident of someone affiliated in their school. We have got to come together and find a way to change this. Canada's post-secondary students deserve to have the best and most culturally responsive tools and supports we can offer. Furthermore, a lot of work is needed to make sure that students can trust these resources so they can feel safe to speak about their experiences. However, despite these devastating and sobering trends, there is much reason for optimism. With funding from WAGE, Possibility Seeds, and Courage to Act, your teams have been working to support the creation of networks and the development of effective tools to address and prevent gender-based violence. Your important work builds on decades of advocacy and efforts led by the provinces, the territories, and by post-secondary institutions, by activists, and of course by students to prevent and address gender-based violence. And since your project began, Possibility Seeds has worked to develop tools and resources for institutions that are large and small, urban and rural, with on and off campus learning. Your team has also established nearly a dozen thematic communities of practice to lead additional efforts. You've connected and convened experts and advocates across the country despite barriers posed by this pandemic. I'm looking forward to hearing so much more from you all today on the progress the Courage to Act team has made and the products that you've developed so far, including the digital campaigns, the webinars, and all the projects led by communities of practice. Your work is truly intersectional in the way it elevates diverse voices, including educators, including frontline workers, and including the students who are Indigenous, racist, racialized, LGBTQ2, newcomers, and immigrants, as well as those with disabilities. You speak for all. I know there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution to such a complex problem. That's why I look forward to learning more about the culturally responsive approaches that can be developed for diverse youth and students all across our country. I want to let you know that our government is committed to ending gender-based violence, and we've taken strong actions to address it. We're in the midst of developing a national action plan to ensure that anyone facing gender-based violence has reliable and timely access to protection and services, no matter who you are and where they live. I've participated with Minister Monsef and others, thousands of people we've spoken to across the country, to make sure that this plan is going to work for all Canadians to end GBV. At this part of the work, we're shaping inclusive and intersectional gender-based violence prevention approaches, and that's going to guide the work around the needs of young people and everyone mentioned, and persons living with disabilities again. I know many of you have been engaged in the work, and I'm grateful for your ongoing support. We're also continuing to invest in transition houses, shelters, and support programs for survivors so that those fleeing violence have a safe, warm, welcoming place to turn. At the same time, we've taken steps to strengthen our justice system to make it more responsive to the needs of survivors and those impacted by GBV. But there's so much more work to be done, and we're committed to see it through. As advocates working to prevent and address gender-based violence, we have so much to do to ensure that our campuses are safe for each and every person. To do this right, we have to make sure that diverse voices, including women and people of all gender identities and expressions, that you're leading the way. By working together, we can help prevent and address GBV. We can create a legacy bigger than any government or any institution alone. We'll create a legacy that will empower women, empower survivors, strengthen families and communities, and create lasting change that will benefit each and every one. I'm so looking forward to the conversation. Thanks again for the invitation, and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Gudie, and we do really appreciate having you here. I know that you stepped out of a caucus meeting for us, so thank you again. I would like to pause now and invite everyone to take a few deep breaths with me. This work can be challenging. Many of us have our own experiences of survivorship and of supporting those we love and care about who've experienced gender-based violence. A gentle reminder here to be attentive to our well-being as we engage in these difficult conversations. You can visit the self-care section of our Skillshare webpage or visit our shelf care room by visiting the link in the chat, which I think Anuth will pop in there. You can also follow along on Twitter with the hashtag GBV National Skillshare. And before I introduce our speakers today, just a quick note on the format. Our speakers will be in conversation for about 35 to 40 minutes, and I invite you to enter any questions or comments into the question and answer box. And together we'll pose the questions at the end. The Q&A will happen around the last 10 minutes of the webinar. At the end, you'll find a link to the evaluation form. This is anonymous, and following the webinar, I'll also email you with a copy of the evaluation form and a link to the recording so that you can review the webinar again and share it within your networks. We have 4 wonderful speakers today who will be sharing their insights and experiences related to gender-based violence on campus, and I'm so happy to introduce them to you now. So today we have Farrah Khan, who is one of Courage to Act's co-directors and has spent 2 decades working diligently to raise awareness about the connection between equity and gender-based violence through education, resource creation, and project management. She's the manager of Consent Comes First, Office of Sexual Violence Support and Education at Ryerson University, and is the founder of Possibility Seeds Consulting. I'm member of the and as well as that, as a member of the Government of Canada's Federal Strategy Against Gender-Based Violence Advisory Council. Farrah is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Toronto Community Foundation's Vital People Award. We also have joining us CJ Rowe, who is also a co-director of the Courage to Act project. For nearly 20 years, Dr. CJ Rowe has worked with organizations developing educational campaigns and research projects. Presently, CJ is the director of Simon Fraser University's Sexual Violence Support and Prevention Office, supporting individuals impacted by sexual violence while developing prevention and intervention educational campaigns. CJ will also be leading the creation of the education toolkit for this project. We are so pleased to have a member of our student organizer community of practice, Vatineh Magaji, join us. She is from Thompson, Manitoba, Treaty 5 territory, and now resides in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, where she completed her Bachelor of Science in Genetics at the University of Manitoba. She served 2 terms as President of Justice for Women Manitoba from 2018 to 2020, a student group addressing gender-based violence within the campus and the greater community. She continues her advocacy work with involvement in Courage to Act's student organizer community of practice, with Reese through the Youth Advisory Board and various roles at the Women's Health Clinic. And last but certainly not least, we are thrilled to be joined by Eternity Martis, an award-winning Toronto-based journalist. She was a 2017 National Magazine Awards finalist for Best New Writer and the 2018 winner of the Canadian Online Publishing Awards for Best Investigative Article. Her work has appeared in Vice, Huffington Post, The Walrus, CBC, Hazlitt, The Fader, Salon, and on academic syllabuses around the world. Her work on race and language has influenced media style guide changes across the country. She's the course developer and instructor of Reporting on Race, the Black Community in the Media at Ryerson University, the first of its kind in Canada, and an adjunct professor in race, gender, sexuality, and social justice at UBC in the 2021 Journalist in Residence at UBC. She earned an honors BA and a certificate in writing from Western University and an MJ from Ryerson University. In 2020, she was named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by Women's Executive Network. Her debut memoir, They Said This Would Be Fun, is a Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, and Vancouver Sun bestseller. CBC has named Eternity one of 6 Canadian writers of Black heritage to watch in 2020, and the book as one of 20 moving Canadian memoirs to read right now. Pop Sugar named it one of 5 books about race on college campuses every student should read, and it is one of Chapter Indigo's best books of 2020. The audiobook has been named Best Audiobooks of 2020 by Apple and Audible, and recently it became a finalist for the International Book Awards in the category of autobiography, memoir, and social change. And so as you can see, we have a brilliant lineup today, and I'm so excited now to turn it over to our presenters.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for setting the stage for our conversation today, and thanks for everyone for joining us. In terms of a format, we thought we would have a bit of a conversation with Eternity first, because I think I can say that myself and probably the 110 people who are on this call are really excited to hear a bit more, Eternity, about your work and about the context of the book, if that's okay. And then Farrah, Vat, and I will join you in a conversation to have a bit of a broader conversation about the impacts of gender-based violence within our post-secondary settings. So to start it off and to start us off, Eternity, I would love for you to help us kind of ground our conversation today by walking us through really the question of why was it important for you to write this book? It's very timely, and you talk about so many different layers and levels of intersections of violence and sexual violence and gender-based violence. Why was it important for this book to come about?
Well, thank you, CJ, and hi, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here. So this book I've actually been writing this book for 10 years, so 10 years before it got published. And the reason was that when I moved to London, Ontario to go to Western, I came here from Toronto, which to me as a teenager was very multicultural. So I went into this experience first really to escape an abusive relationship, but also to just move far away from home and try to find myself on my own and be an adult. And the reason that I needed to write this book was because by the time I got to second year, I was already disillusioned, run down, and ill from the constant daily racism I was experiencing, but also the sexual racism I was experiencing as a Black woman. And so I came from a place where I was very shy and sheltered and everyone looked like me, to ending up in a place where no one looked like me. And all my interactions were about me being Black, me being a Black woman, what my body was like, presumed assumptions about hypersexuality. And this was not just on campus, but it was in nightlife. And if anyone here has gone to Western, you know, there's not a whole lot to do besides party. So it would be in bars where you mix in alcohol, it would be on the street, it would be buying groceries. Someone would say, oh, like you're cute for a Black girl, or we don't have Black girls here, or Black people here. And so as I started to kind of turn inwards and stop going to class and stop participating and just felt sick all the time, no one back home really believed what I was going through. And it wasn't until I was in 3rd and 4th year and I actually met other Black women and other students of color on campus that I not just recognized that we were all going through it and no one could understand, but on the other side of that, that just about every one of my friends had been sexually assaulted or had been in some sort of violent situation. And that was really surprising to me because we never spoke about it. And we were talking about it as if, you know, I want to say something, I wish I could share my story, but how would I share that? This is before Black Lives Matter. This was before Me Too. There weren't a lot of stories about gender-based violence and about race. So as I graduated from Western, it was just 2 months before Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And the world just changed. I came to Ryerson to do my master's of journalism, and we were in an entirely different world. There was the rise of the alt-right and white supremacy and incels, and all of these issues that we had dealt with were now coming to the forefront. And so it felt really important to me to write a book that was my experience and represented the experiences of everyone I knew and their intersecting identities, but also to reflect what we are currently still going through in the world.
Yeah, I love that you just kind of like summarized. So it's almost like you were a future seer, like you're seeing what was needed, the book that was needed. I talked to Notisha Massaquoi, which was a Western alumni recently, and she was just like, I think Eternity saw the future of what we needed and created a book that actually would help cultivate a conversation, because your book actually has created so much of a conversation on campuses. And that's why one of the reasons we really wanted you to be launching the kind of Courage to Act conversations we wanted to see. And I think, you know, what's been happening in America and the conversations that have been happening here in Canada too around race, one of the pieces that we kept coming back to, one of the quotes from your book that you said was, who is afforded rage? Who are the voices on the front lines? Who are praised and uplifted? And whose voices are still in the margins, scolded and shamed for also wanting their moment to be angry? Does this quote hit differently now, you know, like so long after writing your book, resonate differently right now with what's happening in the world and the conversations both about race and gender-based violence?
Yeah, in a way, I didn't want to be right. When I published the book, there was this concern with the publisher that by the time the book came out, all of this would be outdated. And with every draft, with every month that goes by, we can tell that it's just reinforced. The ideas in the book are reinforced. And so I think when I said that, who was afforded rage, unfortunately, nothing has changed, but I think that...
Au contraire, les idées dans le livre ne semblent pas dépassées du tout. Quand je dis, qui se permet d'être en colère, malheureusement...
Angry men. And we also know, even though to a lesser extent people want to acknowledge it, that white men who are part of, you know, far-right movements, white extremism, have committed the most amount of mass murders since 9/11. It's not us, right? It's not immigrants. And so I think that we're still having the same conversations, even when you look at how the police handled the protests on Capitol Hill versus Black people wanting better for Black people. So it's really disappointing to see, but at the same time, I'm kind of happy because I spent so long trying to tell people this is what it is, and being told you're starting a race war. Not everything is about race. Why are you saying that? It's divisive, and we're seeing like the true meaning of who is afforded rage in this moment, especially.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough for having that piece in that book to kind of give us the language that we needed to talk about it. Because I feel like sometimes we don't even get to have an understanding of who's allowed to be angry about this, in terms of even students being told, Black students, students of color, Indigenous students being told, you know, you're overreacting about this conversation, or survivors being told, you know what, it's not as bad as you think. And what I think you named in the book multiple times is that it actually is worse than what has been said.
Absolutely. And I think it's worse also because when you come to university, there's this assumption that you're here to have fun. You're here to have the time of your life. We don't make mistakes. Nothing bad will happen to us. And there are so many things happening to this generation. We are cyber stalked more than other age groups. Intimate partner violence is most common among young women, 15 to 24. Young Black and brown men are carded. There's just so many different things. It's a generation of growing up in school shootings. So all these things that we kind of dismiss to say, oh, you're just kids, ends up happening. And we see that even with the gag orders around sexual assault. Most universities have gag orders. You can't even talk to your therapist about having been sexually assaulted if you report it to a school. And all that goes back to just show that, you know, young people are not being taken seriously. And if we don't address this now, there's going to be lasting problems. They're not going to go away.
I think another question I'd love to dive into before we go into the broader conversation, and I think for us as the team working on the Courage to Act project, it was really important for us to move the conversation past sexual violence and misconduct to one where we're really seeking to tackle addressing and preventing gender-based violence. And now I know that you've been quite vocal, Eternity, especially on threads like the social media thread around December 6th about the importance in your writing of going past sexual violence to talk more fulsomely about the impacts of gender-based violence. Who do you think is left out when campuses have sexual violence as a focus and a main focus of the discussion without going more broadly?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, we leave out those who have also been in intimate partner violence situations. So physical violence, emotional abuse, all of that is completely left out. And the research that does exist shows that intimate partner violence is just as prevalent a crime on campus as sexual assault. So we lose that piece entirely because there's nowhere to go when you're young and you're, you know, even if you're a first or second year and you can't even figure out what your classes are, how can you find, you know, these offices that exist, right? And they don't, there's very few of them. So there's that piece. And then in terms of the sexual assault, like who's left out in that sense of it, it's really anyone who isn't white, cis, and heterosexual. And particularly female identified. So it's BIPOC survivors, it's LGBTQ2S survivors, it's international students. So everyone is kind of left out of that, and they all have their own kinds of, there's all these nuances to it. So for example, if you're Black, you're forced to choose between your race and your gender. Do you want to call the cops if your partner is male and Black? If you are a queer, trans student or non-binary student, there's this idea that, well, there's no such thing as a bad relationship, the lesbian utopia, for example. If you're an international student, you're already dealing with not wanted. So there's all these kinds of nuances and intersecting identities that are completely left out on top of the IPV element of it.
Thank you for that. I think I've also been reflecting on the lack of response and resources around IPV, intimate partner violence, especially at the time of COVID, where people are relegated back into private spaces where there is no necessarily getting away or getting out. And I know that in Ontario and Quebec right now, your abilities to leave your homes and spaces is becoming increasingly difficult again. In the West Coast, we still have a bit more space for a little bit longer, hopefully. And I think that we're seeing more and more of those pieces coming forward, and folks not only not having the ability to see themselves in services like those who focus on sexual violence, but also not having the space in their home life to be able to access supports. And I think your points are so key to us thinking about this much more fulsomely.
I think that's like the piece that we keep coming back to with the project is that too much of the focus had been on sexual violence. Sexual violence is absolutely so important, but I think when I keep going back to that thread that you did in December 6th, where you were like, okay, great that we're working on sexual violence on campuses, but guess what? The same percentage of students that experience sexual violence are probably experiencing intimate partner violence. And if we miss out on that conversation, and it's something that we're really seeing in our conversations with practitioners, is that when they're working with survivors, they don't go, okay, well, now that you're talking about intimate partner violence, I can't help you. I'm going to help you, but I'm going to have to do it on the side of my desk because it's not seen as the main part of my work. Or all the education that students experience that get in first year is mostly about consent education. They don't get the intimate partner violence conversation. And
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And oh, Zoom is so weird. But it's also that even someone like me, for example, who considered I was in women's studies. I took a course on women in violence, and I couldn't put the two together. That I was in an abusive relationship that was also, it was emotionally abusive, it was sexually abusive, but they were two separate things to me. And so there's even that when they're separate, you might be sexual assault in intimate partner relationships. It also exists, but I think that students tend to see them as two different things.
yeah, and I think that's why we want to bring it together, this conversation. So it's not like you're experiencing homophobia over here, and then you're experiencing gender-based violence here, and then sexual assault here, and intimate partner violence there. It's like, this is actually my life. This is the holistic part of my life. And that's why also I really appreciate your book, and I can't say this enough, is that also for, as a racialized person, to be able to read something and say, okay, it's not just about me experiencing this as a woman, but it's also experiencing as a racialized person, the way I'm being attacked and the way I'm being targeted. And I think I'd love to bring Vat into this conversation, because I know that you had a question for Eternity about her book and about this work too. If you want to come into the conversation.
Yes, sorry, I've been like looking down and like writing out my thoughts, because everything that this conversation is like revolving around is synthesizing a lot of the points that I think had come together when I was preparing, I guess, for that webinar that I did, but also in the more global conversations that are happening now. So part of what I was thinking about leading up to this was thinking, I guess, about the impacts that this type of work and addressing these issues in people's lives in post-secondary, how it expands further out to the rest of their lives. I think there's an idea that like we're dealing with these problems, but it's not like the real world. It's not about it's about their experience as a young person, but it doesn't extend further out into the real world, into, well, once you get into the real world, this is how things shift. So I'm wondering, in your book and about thinking about who you're targeting, what you think the expansion of these themes can be when people are moving past post-secondary. I hope that makes sense.
I think I got it. Let's try. So yeah, I think I thought a lot about that, because when I wrote the book, I was so far away from what I had experienced as a student. And one of the last chapters that I actually included in the book was a chapter about sexual assault at all costs and visible bruises, because I didn't want to go there. And I thought, well, one, that's a massive part of being a woman on campus, being a student on campus, and it's also a big part of who I am today. So when I looked back on the book, I realized that a lot of the things that I had done or continued to do, and the anger that I felt and the PTSD that I still had, was because I hadn't dealt with that. And so I think there's no doubt that it doesn't just stay in those 4 years. It affects every part of your life. It affects who you are, who you become. It affects your family, whether you tell them or not. It affects your relationships. It affects your self-esteem. And I wanted to write that because 6 years later, I was still dumbfounded as to why I felt like this. And a big part of my book and the chapter Visible Bruises, it actually came out of my thesis that I did at Ryerson, which was, am I the only one? Like, is this I can't be the only person. And that's how I found out that everyone around me who was at Western was, many people actually were in abusive relationships at the same time, and nobody was talking about it. And we would say, hey, how's your day? We eat lunch, and no one was saying anything. And it was important to me to show that these are things, yes, that happened during that time, those 4 years, but they will stay with you. You never get over it. But when you realize that there is such a larger community of survivors that you can put your strength in and that you can draw strength from, that was important for me to show. And one of the researchers that I spoke to in the book, she talks about how there's really no there's no in between. So there's dating violence resources, and then there's resources for older women. There's nothing for this group. And when that happens, that just means not that it's done, but then when we're in our 20s and 30s and 40s and onwards, we continue the cycle of being victims, or we continue the cycle of being perpetrators. And that's what I really wanted to show, that it's very urgent. And I know that we love to say that, you know, none of these are public health crises or epidemics of violence, but they really are.
I love that you raised that piece around just how if we don't look at young people and the systemicalities that young people experience around gender-based violence, then this is long-term impacts. Because sometimes there is this thing where, especially with shelters, so as a frontline service worker, sometimes when I send young women to shelters, either you go to a youth shelter or an adult women violence against women shelter. But for a young person, when they're 18 and they're dealing with family violence and their family is the one they're abusing them, or they're with a partner that's abusive, they really have nowhere to go. Sometimes it can feel like, because the shelters sometimes are made for what is seen as adult women, and then youth shelters don't have the same supports in place for people who are experiencing violence. And so it's something that still needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. Yeah, that came up when I was researching for my book as well. Nobody felt shelters are supposed to accept, right? It doesn't matter how old a woman is, but young people don't feel like the times that they've had to go, they don't feel like they want to go or that they'd be welcome there.
And no visible bruises, you also talk about like the context that when we talk about violence, we have to not just talk about it as a personal level, but a systemic level. Mm-hmm. And what do you think institutions can do around that piece? What are the role of institutions here around this? Is it just enough, okay, we got an office, we're good?
I know. And I think that we're seeing that play out. Like, what is the role? Because we see it time and again. We see during Frosh Week, for example, there's always, 5 schools in the news that were like marching down the street with pro-rape chants, and they get a slap on the wrist. And in researching for that, I found that most of the time when there were pro-rape chants being led by students, they just got a slap on the wrist. There was nothing else. And so I think institutions, first, university spaces, there needs to actually be, I think they operate from this, we don't want to ruin young lives, but it translates into we don't want to ruin young men's lives. And so there's little action, and because there's no ironclad unified policies, whoever's in charge gets to dole out punishments as they want. So that's the problem there. Then you have the problem with the police, who, especially for young women, we've grown up in hookup culture. We've grown up in like dating app culture. We are more gender fluid than the previous generation, at least. And all of these factors, right? Like living with a partner sooner because we don't have money. All of these factors, if you try to even report that, when you look at like Stats Canada and it tells you what defines a partner, we are so far out of that. So how do you tell an officer, I've been sexually assaulted by some person I'm kind of sort of seeing? It's hard. And so we failed on every level, and we see violence increasing among women. And it's just another story, right? Like, we're not seeing any action. And what it tells me, and I saw this on Twitter, I don't know if it was you who said it, Farrah, but someone just said all of this comes down to the fact that we don't even see women as valuable, right? Or survivors as valuable. So how are we going to, make any institutional change? I'm very passionate about it.
No, I'm more just like it. Yeah, I think all of us are passionate about it. And it's like one of those things where I take a side because it's hard, right? It's in this moment of like, in a lockdown moment where we're seeing governments not taking into account gender-based violence. They're not taking into account young people, how the vulnerabilities of young people, the choices that young people are making around housing, all those pieces you're raising. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's frustrating. We have to start from becoming valuable. And that's a long way to get to where we need to be.
And I wonder, with both you and Vat, to think about this, you talk too about your book, talking about valuing, you talk in your book about the hypersexualization of Black women and the vulnerabilities and the devaluing of Black women's bodies, and how Black women are just not the disrespect on campuses. How do you think, both like as a community organizing around that, so what's been inspiring about that, like ways you've seen Black women support each other, and then what do you think institutions need to do to back up Black women so that we can address this fully?
Yeah, I think one of the greatest things that have come out of the last couple of years is the student activism on campus. So not only are you now a student and you're like, oh my goodness, schoolwork is hard and it's COVID, but now you're also fighting for accountability on campus. And I think that's what's been really great. I think that for a long time, until there was social media, there was this idea that Black women turn on each other or Black women are enemies. But what we're actually seeing is Black women supporting each other. We see it on social media all the time. Just kind of uplifting each other. I know for myself, being a journalist, there are very few of us, and in that there's so much support, right? Like, what do you need from me? Would you like me to do this? I've had some glowing recommendation letters from other racialized women, and I'm like, that was really kind. And she said, as a racialized person, as a Black woman, I know that you're not going to write this yourself, and that if you asked someone who wasn't another racialized woman, you wouldn't get that. So I think that we're all uplifting each other, but I don't think that's enough. And I think institution-wise, a lot of this comes back down to, one, the representations of Black women. The angry Black woman trope is always around. We see poor Serena get it all the time. We see that when we are angry, it's used as comic relief. We've got Tyler Perry just disrespecting Black women everywhere. So there's all of these things that we draw, and I think more so than we'd like to admit, we pull a lot of what we know about other groups of people from media. And so there's that. And then the other part of that is the classes. Like, let's have some classes and let's make them mandatory. Let's do a class like the one that I had just taught, where we learn about representation. We look back on what we've done wrong so we can do better. Let's look at Serena. What are those historical stereotypes that she has been subjected to? How do we start to change that? How do we make people accountable? And that revolves around a critical thinking piece that I think a lot of students don't necessarily have because they haven't been in the curriculum. We've all been reading Eurocentric texts since who knows. And so that's really important, at least on a campus level. And there was something that Natisha said a couple of months ago when we were in that panel that really stuck with me. So Natisha was fighting to remove Philip Rushton from campus when she was a student. And he still had tenure until I was a student. And what she had said was he taught a lot of scientific racism, and he taught his students that Black women were hypersexual because they had larger genitals. And she said very shortly after that, when Black women would go out into the city, into bars, they were sexually harassed, sexually assaulted, very hypersexualized. And she believes it was a direct result of one of the most popular professors at Western sharing this. So we need to stop that, take ownership as campuses, and replace it with actual real education.
You're speaking my language, Eternity. I think I'm such a big proponent for education because we don't know what we don't know. Yeah. And it's a bridge into building compassion and understanding. And we have to know the history, and we need to be able to critically engage and reflect and act. I think that you have another question and also an invitation to join this conversation. So I want to hand it on over to you.
Sure. I was thinking about the place that your book, Eternity, has in obviously the conversation around gender-based violence and the way that you were able to use your personal experience to create this like text to be able to inform and educate others. And I'm wondering, like, how does that process play out for you as far as taking care of yourself and protecting yourself, but still also wanting to be very open and vulnerable to be able to create this tool for others to use?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I might have failed on the taking care of myself front because I think that when you write a book like this, you have to be intentional about why you're doing it. And you have to be willing to make sacrifices. And when I say that, it means you may lose your friends, you may lose your sanity, which I think I did. And but it felt really important to me as a storyteller and as someone who is really committed to telling the truth as part of my job, that I tell this story because it's not just my story, it's everyone around me. And I really tried to take care of myself, but it's very hard. I found that chapter, Visible Bruises, for example, I would just not talk to anyone for a week and just sit there in my room. And if you talk to me, I would snap at you. And I started to see my therapist and we'd talk through it. But I think it was a reminder of when you set forward, and I'm sure there are people here who want to tell their story, it's not just a retelling of memories. When you dive back into those memories, you find out what happened to you, what you may have done wrong, what you could have done, and why you are the way you are now. And so memories are incredibly powerful, and they can be very hurtful. So, I mean, my self-care at the time was to take walks, look at cute like videos of babies. I love babies and dogs, and those were all great, but it still wasn't enough in the end. But it felt necessary to tell the story, because since the book has been published, I get a lot of messages from people who are like, when I read your book, all these repressed memories about how I was treated as a survivor, as a racialized woman, they all came to the surface because I was told for many years that none of that mattered. It wasn't serious. It wasn't a big deal. So I think Lou's temporarily kind of being a little bit unhinged to tell the story and work through it in the end really helped me work through it and process it. But it also had it worked with my intention, right? Other people are able to process it. And I think that when it comes to being a survivor or even a Black woman, anytime you say anything about your discomfort, someone tells you you're entitled, you're angry, it's not that bad, you're a student, like you should be having fun. And then it gets repressed. So there's generations of women, of young women, of racialized people who are feeling that right now. And so it was really important for me to just tell the story, right? And tell the amount that was still respectful to my boundaries, and that would be respectful to my family. And one thing that I did deal with in the editing process was tell us more about the assault, tell us more about what happened to you. And it was very important to me to say, for those of the people who need to get it, they will get it. I can say less and it will tell them everything they need to know, so that this doesn't become trauma porn, and sticking with that.
And I'm kind of thinking as well on the same part of how it can be used, or telling your story to the people who wouldn't ordinarily hear it, be it like your friends or your family or the people from your home community. And I'm wondering how that played into things, and the reception that happened after publicizing your story in that way.
Yeah, so nobody knew any of those things. And I come from a South Asian family. And like many cultures, you don't talk about partying. You don't talk about like, I got so drunk and, fell asleep on the lawn, which did not happen, but I've seen it happen. But you just don't say things like that, right? That's not what you do. And so I do come from a very liberal family, and there's never been any gender expectations, no expectations of anything really, except be yourself. And so I actually gave my family and my siblings copies of my book, like literally like 2 weeks before it was published, because I was so terrified. And they were upset in the best way. I think they were upset for me, and they felt like they could do something. And I think there's not a lot you can do when you're a parent, because these are just things that happen. You grow up, you go away, you're on your own, and life happens. And it's important for us to have a support system, but it's also important for us to learn how to kind of deal with it ourselves while having that support system. And so since writing it, I think they've become, as you know from the book, there's a lot of confusion around my own identity in my family. They didn't see me as a Black woman because they are brown and they raised me. So I think it solved a lot of those issues, and it became race in general, sexual violence, violence against women. Those all became even more kind of big issues in my family that we talk about, and to my friends. And one thing I was worried about, when you write about being a survivor, you don't want to be labeled as a survivor the rest of your life. And you don't want everyone to just think that that's who you are. And they were really great about not pigeonholing me, that I was more than just that. I was sharing an experience, and it was a brave thing to do, but I'm so much more than that as well.
That's so encouraging to hear. And I feel as though lots of people of racialized backgrounds, or who have parents maybe that would have seen this type of thing in a similar way, to hear that you're okay and the reception was overall okay, I think that's a really powerful message to be able to spread, and I'm glad that was the case for you.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna jump in, and thank you so much to all four of you for leading such a wonderful conversation so far. I do want to invite folks in the chat to drop any questions that they have for our panelists into the Q&A box. And then I will pass those questions off to our lovely speakers. So if anybody has anything, feel free to drop it in there now. I do have a question in the meantime. So Eternity, you talk a lot about being part of the change now in your book, and that we can create quiet revolutions and roaring revolutions. We can be part of a call to action and a reminder that we're part of a legacy. So where do you draw inspiration? And for all of you, what continues to fuel some of your writing and activist practices? What inspires you?
Do you want me to go first? Yeah, okay. For me, really, it's quite simple. It's like feminist texts, and that I kind of hold my texts like my school readers closely. I think that when I was going through all this at Western, as I talk about in the book, there's this aha moment where Bell Hooks talks about desire and being a Black woman. And I was like, oh my goodness, this exists. So I think for me, I was able to put everything that I had experienced into context because of so many Black scholars and feminists and queer theorists, and be who I was and get to write because of them. So for me, my inspiration comes from all of the greats. And I still read them from time to time when I need a boost, but that's definitely where it comes from.
I know for me, being a part of Courage to Act has been the fuel for the past 2 years, being able to talk to, we have about 150 people a part of this project, and it's just been like amazing to feel like we're actually on the precipice of actually doing change. So that excites me all the time. But also feminist texts, yeah, I think for me was knowing that there was feminists that were talking about things that I didn't even know we could have conversation about. So for me was Hamani Banerjee was one of the first South Asian feminists that I ever read. And then when I got to be in her class, and I almost like couldn't handle it because she was my prof and I got to be like near her. So I think that's also that thing about being in school and being near profs that like just blow your mind. What about you, Vat?
I would say, I think a lot of my drive to move forward lies with like my friends and the people that I surround myself with. I feel like with all the good and the bad that has come through us as we're growing up together, the thought that I can contribute to like reducing that bad for us now and like for their kids in the future and that sort of thing, that really is driving me forward in a very broad sense. And also, you know, I would like to have a career where I can help people, and I feel like I want to be able to build a strong foundation now so that whatever I choose to do in the future, I can take all these ideas with me and make sure that I'm, you know, being informed with the things that I'm learning now.
I think to echo some of what I'm hearing, where I'm finding some inspiration is definitely, as far as working with the Courage to Act teams, and it's getting to work with folks. I mean, really as a team and as an integrated thought machine in some ways. To get to, I love being able to understand the world one way and then have an opportunity to learn about it in a whole new way that I've never thought of before. And so again, I often joke and say, I'm really thankful for the activists who came before me so I can wear pants and so that I can move into the gender identity and expression that is more truly myself. And my job is to figure out how to make things better so that those who come after me, and Eternity, that's a piece that I found echoed in your book in a few different quotes that I've pulled out and have on sticky notes, because I think it's reading writers like yourself that help ground me in the work that I'm doing and keep me accountable to doing the work that's needed now.
Thank you all. I think we have time for just one more quick question. So Sylvia was wondering, she would love to know if Eternity has any thoughts on transformative justice as a future for approaching gender-based violence. And if anybody wants to jump in after Eternity, that would be great.
Yes, I'd love someone to jump in because I haven't given it a lot of thought, but I also don't have a lot of trust in the police system. There was an article, I was trying to find it just now, but there was an article, I think it was in Yes magazine, that talked about how do we transform accountability, and what are some other ways when you're experiencing gender-based violence. So I would love for someone else to step in, but I definitely think there are alternatives. So I'll just say that.
Yeah, I can jump in for a sec. I'm really excited that we actually have a working group with a community of practice within community of Courage to Act that's looking at transformative justice on campus and what it can be and what it can't be. I think our communities, the racialized communities, have been doing transformative justice work for a long time. Indigenous communities have been doing it for a long time. You know, even from the sense of like, I don't think I can trust the police that I can tell them their stories, but I'm going to deal with child sexual abuse in my family. That's how we dealt with child sexual abuse in my family. You know, sometimes not in the best ways, but in other ways we did, because we're like, we're going to talk to this person, we're going to isolate them this way, we're going to make sure they get accountability this way. So I think it's really important to see that there's amazing work being done around this, and communities have been doing it for a really long time, and especially be led by Black, Indigenous, and racialized women.
Yeah, I think the first thing, or echoing Farrah's point, is understanding and bringing legitimacy to the methods that already exist and that have existed for so long, and trying to get to the root of them and integrate them, or have them replace potentially different justice-seeking methods that are already in place. I think that's could potentially be a good starting point, but I'm very excited to hear about the group of transformative justice for Courage to Act as well.
I just keep looking over at my bookcase, wanting to grab the books to show everyone on the screen. And Eternity, thank you for making the suggestion for folks to take a look at Kai Cheng Tom's book, I Hope We Choose Love, because Kai Cheng is doing some wonderful work around transformative justice. And if you haven't had an opportunity to come into and get familiar with her work, please do make the time. Great resource.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. Eternity, Farrah, CJ, Vatineh, we're so deeply appreciative of the discussion today, and thank you for kicking off the National Skillshare series with such an important conversation, and for sharing your time and expertise with us. We've learned a lot today and have been able to hear so much of your valuable insight, and the recording will be available on our website in just a few days. I also want to thank our participants for joining us and for sharing with us today. We appreciate and take inspiration from your commitment to addressing and preventing gender-based violence on campus. And we're really lucky to be able to work alongside each and every one of you. So thank you for joining us. And to all of our attendees, just a kind reminder to please fill out the evaluation form. And don't forget that registration is open to sign up for all of the remaining Skillshare sessions that are part of the National Skillshare series beginning January 2021. And they actually go all the way until August of this year, when we'll launch the working groups toolkits. So the Skillshare series will highlight some of the groundbreaking work being done across Canada to address gender-based violence on campuses, and we'll showcase the 15 tools and toolkits being developed by our 150 plus project partners, including our communities of practice. So you can sign up on the Courage to Act website. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Thanks for